Hello, and welcome to Ancient Jesus Future Faith. I am one of your hosts, Tana Sheaver, and I'm here with Sarah Menardi.
Hello.
And Don Sheaver.
Hey.
And today we're going to be talking about the topic of salvation. And to get us started, I'm just going to read Philippians 2:12, which says, "Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." That was Philippians 2:12. So a letter from Paul. And that is the extent of my knowledge about that.
Nice.
So Don.
Well, so I think the very first place we want to start is, what does that verse feel like to you? Because I don't know that many of us have been taught that verse, but if you have, feel free to give response to it. But how does that verse feel?
It feels like a burden because I hear the words like work out. Well, I wasn't. That even sounded more of a burden when I said it out loud.
I hate working out too.
I don't know what that word means.
I was just going to say work, and then I was looking at my Bible and it said work out. And yeah, both of those. And then the fear and the trembling on top of it. So working out, fear, trembling. I just want to leave.
Yeah, exactly.
And bye. Yeah, I think ditto what Sarah said.
Yeah, it's not very promising.
Yeah.
Right. So clearly Paul is trying to seemingly encourage them that in his absence that they continue to participate in some way in calisthenics of salvation.
Calisthenics of salvation.
Right.
That sounds horrible.
Look for our new merch with calisthenics of.
That's it. I'm starting an exercise series called Calisthenics of Salvation.
It could be like exercise them.
Exercising series. Okay. What I do want to add about the work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, it does make me think immediately about salvation as like being saved from hell. The fear and trembling part kind of brings in the whole hellfire.
Right. It fits neatly into that setting, right?
Sinners in the hands of an angry God. You know?
Yes, or at least spiders hanging over bonfires.
Is that your hell?
No, that's Jonathan Edwards' actual metaphor.
Oh. I didn't know that.
So you quote the book, but you didn't.
I've never actually.
Okay.
No, I did. I just don't remember it.
Okay, well, fair enough. So that being said, we digress often. Just not into working out. That's the only thing we cannot digress into. So, although, Sarah, you rode your bicycle here today. So
kudos.
Yeah, you were way ahead of us. I think I barely made it down the steps. So
yeah, our car's in the shop, to be fair. But
you didn't.
You didn't have to admit that, man. You could have just
take the glory.
Yeah, just bathed in basked. That's the word I was looking. Basked in your piety.
Yes, I do bike a lot, but this one had a specific purpose.
So, all right. Well, so what about? So we kind of got into the fear and trembling, what that plays into kind of the psyche of this. But what about when someone walks up to you, and hopefully it doesn't happen very much, but I think we all have had this experience where someone walks up to you or in the middle of a conversation just kind of dumps on you. Are you saved? Right? What is that experience for you?
I actually had that happen to me somewhat recently. I want to say just in the last couple of years. I was walking downtown to a friend's place and some guy just randomly stopped and asked me that. And I immediately tense up because I know where it's going.
Where's it going?
It's always a usually very fundamentalist evangelical person trying to just save random people off the street. And no matter what answer you give, they're never satisfied. They want to keep talking and make sure you're the right kind of saved.
Right. Yes. Yes. We don't want like mediocre saving. It's got to be full.
Well, and I've tried in the past. I've tried sometimes to kind of, I guess, prove my bona fides. I'll be like, well, my husband's a pastor. You know?
Oh yeah, that'll get you anywhere.
and then they're like, at what kind of church? You know, like what kind of pastor? And it's like, okay, you know,
Bible believing church.
right. All those shibboleths, you know, of So.
What about you, Sarah?
I can't remember a direct time that I've been asked that.
Whoa, really?
Yeah.
You're an anomaly.
Wow.
I feel like, though, because I'm sensitive and I'm always thinking like 3 steps ahead, that I interpret like any question about my faith as like going there, or most of my interactions are with people who know at least that I'm a believer, and so they're just like those little questions that are checking up on me.
Yeah.
Like there was a time at the park recently, and this person I ran into just immediately was, "Are you going to church? What church are you going to? Are your mom and dad going to church?" And these people don't even know my mom and dad. And yeah, it's just, I don't know.
Yeah.
Not cool. Let me
right.
just say that.
So-
Tensing up, yeah, all the feels, not cool. I just kind of smile and nod and say like the most vague, least thing I can possibly say, which I'm kind of good at, and then let the conversation end.
Well, so I've had the opportunity to talk about this topic on several occasions, and I love asking these questions. And one thing I have noticed that is always true is nobody likes that question.
Yeah.
Right.
Like no one's like, "Oh my gosh, I was worried that no one was going to ask me that today." Like, thanks for checking on me.
I was lost and now I'm found.
That's right. Just all of a sudden be like, "Wait, where am I? Oh my gosh."
Jeez. I would be curious to ask the people who ask those questions, like what their success rate is.
Well, I don't
You know?
I don't know that they have a good barometer for what is success.
Well,
I think people being
fair.
offended, people responding in any way is probably success. So it's not necessarily
Probably like, I got them thinking.
right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that for me, one of the things I've experienced is that when people are asking that question, or I've heard people talk about being asked that question, it rarely is a positive setting, right? It's rarely that, even the person asking the question isn't asking it from a place of positivity. Like
yeah.
I would argue, hopefully at best, it's a place of concern, right? And so there's nothing positive. So I think that's a good setting for us to think about this conversation. So the Greek word for salvation is soterios, and I may be mispronouncing that, so forgive me, all of you Greek scholars out there. But soterios is the idea of salvation. Now, what's interesting is that if you go and you use a rabbinic method of interpretation, which is first use, you go and you find where that is first used. And anyone know where that is, where soterios is first used in the text? It's actually an obscure passage.
No, I don't think I know.
All right.
So it's Isaac digs some wells, and after digging some wells, him and his family leave the area, and it says, and they left safely, right, from the area. Now, what about fear and trembling? Where's the first use of this phrase, fear and trembling?
Well, I know this answer, but only because I've heard you talk about this before.
All right.
That's allowed.
So should I share?
Well, Sarah, do you want to crack at it first?
No, go ahead, Tana.
After, wait a minute, maybe I'm wrong now. Now I think I'm wrong.
That's okay.
After the flood?
Yes. In what context?
The animals.
Yes, that now the animals will live in fear and dread, I believe is how most of it, but it's the same language, fear and trembling of humans. So let's start there of those two pieces. Let's, instead of starting with soterios, let's start with fear and trembling. So why, after the flood, what changes in the relationship with animals that now they're going to live in fear and trembling of humans?
Now, see, that was the question I was wondering, because my first thought originally was like, oh, about the garden and about how, now we were going to use them for food. But that would have happened before the flood, right? No?
No.
Oh, the food?
Yeah.
Oh,
It's not mentioned as food until you get to the flood narrative.
oh, okay.
But still, now everything's good to be eaten, could be argued that that would strike fear into the hearts of animals, right?
Right.
Any other thoughts?
Well, it was man that led to the flood, not the
Yes.
animals. So,
Absolutely. Right. Perfect. That's exactly spot on, right? So the animals now live in fear of humans because humans brought about the flood. The animals didn't bring about the flood. Humans brought about the flood. And now animals are recognizing they are dependent on humans living in a manner that does not bring their destruction, right? And I would argue animals are still in that same boat, no pun intended,
Yeah.
today, right? I mean, think about whether it's monarch butterflies or it's polar bears or it's any number of things or even species we never witnessed
Right.
that are now extinct, right? That animals really depend on humans and humans' greed, humans' desire to take whatever it wants. So animals are still stuck with this way of depending on humans to do it well, right?
Yeah.
So, all right. So let's imagine if that is the case, that fear and trembling comes from a dependency on how humans are functioning. Does that begin at all to reshape Philippians 2:12? Like, work out your salvation in fear and trembling. What does the fear and trembling now mean or feel like to you?
Well, it feels kind of worse. Like, or God will smite you with another flood.
Okay. Sarah?
I think like work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. So the animals were dependent upon humans. So maybe we're the fear and trembling because we're dependent, and being aware of that we're dependent in order to have safety. Going back to the Isaac.
Yeah. I mean, same thing was true with the animals, right? The animals desiring safety must function in fear and trembling of humans,
Yeah.
right? Okay. So we're going to add a couple more layers on here, and then we'll dig out of the layers into hopefully something that is a little bit more comprehensible. So anyone know what the Hebrew word is that is used, that soterios gets translated? So just a real quick lesson here. The Hebrew Bible was originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic primarily. At some point in late or early before Common Era, I don't know how you refer to it, but closer to the zero, it was translated into Greek as Hellenism had swept the world, and more of the Jews of that time had lost a little bit of their ability to read and understand Hebrew. They were more likely to have been raised in a setting where they learned Greek. And so some people got together, interpreted and translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and that's called the Septuagint. So soterios is in the Septuagint. The first usage is with that passage with Isaac. Any guess of what the original Hebrew word is in that same verse that those sages translated to soterios?
Shalom.
Yep. So this idea of salvation or safety or shalom or peace, right? So this is kind of the background of all of this story. So when you think of the word of shalom, what do you think of?
Peace.
Yeah, and anything bigger than that, or is just like peace, man?
I think specifically like the peace of God,
Okay.
which feels like a more otherworldly kind of peace, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
So in this picture now, we're starting to see a little bit more, I would argue, of what the heart of this is. So how do you imagine someone works out safety through fear and trembling?
Well, I think of fear. I have a broad view of fear. I know some people struggle when the Bible says fear of God, like what applying that. But to me, it's always just made sense because as a parent, I have a fear of like my daughter falling off the ledge. She loves to walk on those curb things every time a curb comes up, or like if we're in a parking lot, whatever those things are called that define the front of the spaces. She wants to balance on those, like little balance beams. So I have like a fear of her getting hurt and falling off, and it leads me to caution. So like I don't have any problem having a fear of God as a negative thing because to me it implies caution or care in my relationship with God. That I approach God with care. I don't see it as like a negative thing. So I think of that here when you talk about fear and trembling. That's that's one of the ways that I see the word fear. That it's not always just a negative, scary thing, but that fear also helps us to be wise and take care of ourselves and other people. If we don't have that sense of fear, then we are on the playground and you walk right off the edge.
Right.
That's so interesting and much more beautiful than what I'm thinking. Because I think this is, probably baggage from the way I was taught things growing up. But for me, the idea of working out safety with fear and trembling is very much like, it's kind of like all of the messages of fear I got about possibly being robbed. Where it was just like constantly make sure that your car is locked and then the, check under your car when you get back out to it because someone
Right.
might be hiding underneath it, So all of those sort of like hedges
Yeah.
that people layered over the years of, in order to be safe, you need to view the world as dangerous.
Yeah. So this is really helpful and indicates to me that I'm kind of teaching this in a wrong order. So let me take a step back
Okay.
and reapproach. So if we were to take the word soterios, salvation, and use the word safety or safe, how does that change when someone walks up to you and says, Sarah, are you safe?
Yeah, I had actually written that in my notes because, and I didn't want to interrupt you earlier, but yeah, how would the question change? The same thing, like
Yeah.
it's a different question if somebody comes up and asks, "Are you safe?"
Right, and
which to me implies, "Are you provided for? Are your needs met?"
Yeah.
Right. Or doubly, are you a safe person for me to talk to?
Yeah,
Right. And so now all of a sudden, this is positive, right? Like when you're engaging someone, this is coming from a place of concern potentially, if you're like, are you safe and worried about their well-being, but also like it's a place of like of hope, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of the areas that's really important for us to recognize that as Christianity aged And as more and more Gentiles came into and took leadership positions in the church, and in the expression of the faith and in the interpretation of the text and all of those things, all the way up through current time, it became less and less that the Bible was written about physical things and was more instead what is the philosophical thing being expressed, what is the spiritual thing being, and this is Platonism that has really seeped into, right? That the physical and the spiritual are always in battle. And so the Bible and the New Testament particularly is about spiritual things, not about physical things. Whereas ancient Judaism looked at most of these passages and most of these ideas in the text as something being very physical. There was a physicality of everything, right? Leave the corners of your field, physical, right? Take care of the poor and the sojourner, physical, right? All of the activities were physical. So imagine, if you will, a early Christian hearing this idea of, are you saved? Like, are you safe? There would have been an idea of physicality to that question. That today, when someone asks you, are you saved? They're most likely, I shouldn't assume that they aren't, but they're not concerned about your physicality.
Right.
They are absolutely only concerned about your mind and your heart, right? And this feels different when all of a sudden you're asking someone about physicality. Do you agree?
Yeah.
So when Paul writes this, the you there's plural, right? At the beginning of Philippians, the section of Philippians, right? He's like you. He's not talking to like Fred. He's speaking to you, the congregation, right? And because of that, there's a plurality here of you as a community work out your safety in fear and trembling. So now I'm going to reapproach the fear and trembling piece. I'm going to give you two examples. One is 9/11. Who was working out safety in fear and trembling on 9/11?
First responders?
Yeah. Fire department, medical, even everyday citizens, right? They were going into the buildings, not for their own safety, but for the collective safety, right? And you can't imagine them doing that without fear and trembling, right? That they were willing to set aside some of their own well-being in order to bring about the salvation, the physical salvation of people stuck in these burning infernos, right? That is a really great picture, especially if you think about Paul and who he's talking to and what's going on in Rome and the oppression of people and all of the harm that is coming to folks, right? And Paul is saying, I wish I could be there, but while I'm not there, continue to work out your safety in fear and trembling. Now, why is it important to have fear and trembling? Like, I would argue that those firemen, those first responders, those citizens needed to have fear and trembling to do this well. Why?
So that they take the proper precautions?
Yeah, you named it earlier, right?
Yeah.
Caution, right? Like, it doesn't do, like, if you see someone drowning in a 20-foot deep area and you can't swim,
Right. Doesn't do any good for you to try
you're
to help
probably better off trying to find someone that can swim to jump in and save them versus you jumping in to save them, right? Because you have caution. You recognize that it's not necessarily wise for me to do so, right? So in this moment, these officers, these firemen, these civilians, whoever, right, had to take measure and say, I'm not invincible. This is dangerous. And I need to use great caution when going in. I need to make sure. I think about like airplanes. It says, you know, when the masks drop, you cover your face before you cover your child's, which needs to be reminded, because I think too many of us with children or seeing a small child next to us would want to cover their face first, but that's not healthy.
Right. If you pass out before you even get the mask on your kid, then
Then your kids.
both. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So the second example I want to use is more recent and devastating. And that is Uvalde. And this is a moment where, and I want to be careful here because I can't even imagine what a mass shooting experience and as a first responder would be like. So I want to approach this very carefully. I just think that it's an example we can look at on the surface. And these officers, or the first responders in this instance, did not run in to create safety.
Do you mind if I interject one thing?
I would love you to.
I was recently watching a video that sort of broke down the whole timeline for all of that. And there were something like 400 first responders there. I think they were all police. I'm not sure. And only one followed the training they were given for this type of situation and actually approached the classroom door to take whatever were the next steps, and then had to retreat and was ordered to retreat because no one followed him.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I don't want to turn this particular discussion into a judgment on the ins and outs of Uvalde. I just think that it is a juxtaposition,
Right.
right? Where at some point it was deemed or determined that the fear and trembling was too powerful to make a decision for the safety. Like it was self-preservation. And I think it's easy for all of us to get in self-preservation. This is another reason I don't want to knock the individuals involved with Uvalde, right? Mm-hmm. Because I have been in situations where I have decided to self-preservation, right? Instead of maybe stepping in and potentially creating safety at my own risk. So if we are to use this picture of fear and trembling to create safety, what do you imagine Paul is really getting at here then? Like, is this like an altar call? Because I think that's what we've made it.
Yeah. I mean, it seems more to me, especially work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. I think I'm going to assume that your is also the collective.
Yes.
But I think that can easily be misread because in my translation, it says your own. Mm. So if I was just reading that and didn't look at the your to see if it was plural, I would have taken that to be singular, work out my own salvation. So, but again, with the work out your own, like everybody's salvation in this group with fear and trembling, it means do the hard things to help make sure that everybody in this community is safe.
Yeah.
And provided for.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would add, I don't think I've ever heard that taught as outside of Don as collective salvation.
I think that's something we have to be really careful about. That's a limit of the English language. Other languages have different words for the plural of you. And
we have y'all.
Yeah, but I mean, especially looking at the text, that that's could be added to the little list of red flag things to think about when you're reading a Bible passage.
Absolutely.
Is when you see your, we don't know just by looking at it as just the word if it's plural automatically or singular.
And here's a recommendation for the audience. Always assume it's plural, right? Like very few passages are speaking to a single person.
That makes sense.
But we have that individualistic lens in this country.
Right, we call it your personal salvation.
Exactly. And so your own salvation here, definitely, I can see any one of us just reading that going, oh, that's about me.
Right. As opposed to a community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a community working out its salvation in fear and trembling. How does that apply? Like, what does that mean?
Well, I immediately think about the people who lowered the paralytic down to Jesus, they broke through the roof and lowered him down. And is that I might be conflating verses, but is that the verse where he says, because of your friends of your faith, or
Faith of your
the
friends?
faith of your friends, because of the faith of your friends?
He says, because of their faith, your sins are forgiven. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that to me feels like working out, someone else's salvation with fear and trembling. Because, I mean, was it that easy to just hop on a roof and break through things and maybe risk the anger of,
Of the homeowner.
And,
Yeah, if there's a hole for the person to go down, there's a hole for you to fall down.
Right, exactly.
And also
exactly.
now there's a sunlight in my living room.
A
Right?
sunlight, SON.
Oh, boy.
Jesus was there.
All right. Well, it was really nice being with all of you. So yeah, I think that this becomes important for us to recognize, one, the pluralness of this, because this is a Jewish faith that is based in community, not based in individualism, right? And it's important also for us to think about this idea that salvation is about us working. It's not a mistake that Paul uses that language, working. In fact, Paul says it elsewhere when Paul says, daily I work out my salvation. Right? And it's important for us to take this into a space where we're going, what is my obligation as a part of a community? What is my obligation, and what is our obligation as part of a community to secure or bring about safety for those in our midst? And I think that really begins to change the way that, and I think it also changes that we probably would not walk up to someone and say, are you safe? Right? Are you soterios? Are you shalom? Right? I think instead we would find ways to engage the person to ensure that the space that they're in is good for their well-being. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if that's the case, how are we as a church or as a faith community or as just a faith in general, what obligation does that put on us? Because right now the obligation is altar calls.
Right.
And I would argue this isn't about altar calls, because altar calls create converts, not salvation.
I'd say it's what we're typically taught, at least what I've typically been taught, is altar calls and tithing. Especially if there's maybe some sort of outreach ministry of the church that a couple people are in charge of. And it's like, well, I'll just give and then they'll do the work.
Oh, interesting. I heard that differently. I heard that as like a capitalism statement of, we convert people by altar calls so that way they'll give.
Well, that too.
we turn them into customers.
I mean, there's that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
so if we can make a differentiation that I don't think people want to make or like to make, and that is the difference between someone who has converted and someone who has received salvation. How would you differentiate those two things? How would you have? Maybe we'll start there, and then, or would you have? And
I don't think I would have. It at least not from my experience, because I don't think for example, I grew up Catholic, and then I went to an evangelical church in my teen years. And I would say when I was just attending the church, I wouldn't have considered myself a convert. But then when I went to a thing and basically responded to an altar call, I would have said I was a convert and then I was saved. Because at least at the time, what I was being taught was that I wasn't saved before as a Catholic.
right.
Even though I was, baptized and
Right. Yeah. There's some weird stuff in Christianity
right.
around Catholicism.
So in my mind, it was one and the same.
Yeah. What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I think similar. Like to be converted, to proclaim Jesus as your Lord and Savior is like salvation and conversion. I think, yeah.
Yeah, so in ancient times, convert meant very similar to what it means today, that someone has acknowledged that your belief system is one that they agree with or that they're attracted to, and they want to become a member, right? But that doesn't guarantee that someone is safe when they do that. In fact, I would argue in a lot of cases, it puts them in great danger, right? Especially in ancient times. Right? Because you would have been leaving your family's ethnically attached God and religion, abandoning it to convert to another ethnicity's religion,
Right.
and therefore actually really cause some problems. In fact, Jesus, the only time talks about conversion, says you go across the sea to make a single convert, twice the sons of hell as you.
Right.
Right? So when we make this physical, right, and we read things such as believe in Jesus and you will be saved, right? How does that begin to play out or not play out? What is confusing or makes more sense now about that?
Well, it feels like for me, I don't still attach a physicality to that, of being, how did you just word it?
Believe in Jesus and you will be saved.
Yeah, I don't think I ever attached a physical part to that.
To the saved part or the believe part or both?
Both. Because at the time it was all about, you had to have the right beliefs to be saved.
Right.
It had nothing to do with actually doing anything.
Correct.
You just had to say the right words.
Right.
And imagine that that's just not what the Bible gets at all. And again, this is influence of Platonism in our study and thinking about its Greek philosophy coming into a Jewish faith that made this about right belief and not about being adopted into a family, right? So in this Greek, we choose to translate it through that Platonistic lens of thought versus physicality. And so we translate passages similar to the one I just said, as in, if you have faith in Jesus, you will be saved.
Right.
That passage can be translated just as accurately if you're approaching it from a physical perspective as because of the faithfulness of Jesus, you are saved. Now, how does that begin to change things? What does it mean that because of the faithfulness? So if we hear it that way, if someone said to you, hey, Tana, because of the faithfulness of Jesus, you are saved. Does that begin to change anything for you?
Not initially.
Well, first of all, it's off of you now. It's not your faith that makes you saved. It's Jesus's faithfulness. And when you hear someone is a faithful person, is that physical or intellectual?
Physical.
Yeah. And so the physicality of Jesus and the way Jesus lived and the way Jesus taught us to live brings about your safety. Right? That changes so much, right? And the text can be read that way just as easily. In fact, I would argue it's more easy to get to that space in understanding and reading the text that way. N.T. Wright actually wrote quite a bit on this. I'm not necessarily a huge N.T. Wright fan, but he did write quite a bit on this idea that it can be read as Jesus's faithfulness brings about your salvation. And that this idea that in some way, the way Jesus lived his life, encountered the world, taught us to live our life and encounter the world, brings about safety. It brings about safety for us, safety for others, and a spreading safety throughout the world. And what that forces us to do is think about this in a physical way that doesn't let us get away with thoughts and prayers. Right? Thoughts and prayers is where we go as Christians because we're taught all of this is about mind and heart, therefore thoughts and prayers, as opposed to the physicality of the first responders rushing into the towers, right? Or just even any place, right, that a first responder or a concerned citizen rushes into a space that is maybe threatening to themselves, but they're doing it out of concern for the well-being or the safety of someone that's being harmed or in potential danger. So does this begin at all to shift for you? And in what ways? What is the impact? What do you imagine the impact would be on the church if this is the way we were to engage the text?
I think it would beg the question continually, what am I and what are we doing to create safety, which to me means meeting physical needs and mental needs and caring for the people in the community.
Yeah.
As opposed to tracking who said the right words in the right order.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's one of the things that, think about how much this has impacted us, that the number of times when someone says, just so you know, I'm really going through a tough time, et cetera, and I'll say to them, how can I care for you? And they'll say, pray for me.
Yeah. Well,
Because we're left with thoughts and prayers.
Well, I think there's also, for some reason, for a lot of us, and I'm one of them, this like idea that you shouldn't ask for your personal needs. I've had multiple people just in the last week saying, is there anything I can do to care for you? And I'm like, I'm good. I'm not good.
Right.
There are things I need, and there's things we're struggling with. And, but it's this weird thing where it's like I wonder if it comes from this idea that our faith is individual and it's also very intellectual, and whether or not we intend for that to be the case, like the carryover from that's possibly what's happening. I mean, I've even been struggling with you kind of guiding us through this, and you're like, well, does that change how you view it? Does that change how you view it? And my brain keeps working it around to, faith isn't physical. I believe faith is physical, but for some reason I'm having difficulty. You said the faithfulness of Jesus means you have safety. Does that change it for you? And I'm thinking, well, that's him doing stuff, not me. Like there's so many ways to let yourself off the hook. And I don't actually believe that. I believe we should be physically caring for one another, but there are still those moments where I'm still trying to kind of overcome that individualistic, personal mindset that everybody just has to deal with their own stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the faithfulness of Jesus, thinking about it as because we don't think about Jesus as rabbi, or like I feel like there's maybe a slightly different nuance that might have been true of the time, to think that like when we're looking at our rabbi and how he lives his life, that we are meant to emulate that. Whereas like with our Western lens, without thinking about that, we can just think, oh, Jesus did that, and then here I am over here.
Right.
But there's that implied, like we're supposed to follow Jesus, do what Jesus did. So his faithfulness is like the model. So then as we do what the model, that's what turns it into the physical. We don't get to just
sit back on our laurels because Jesus did it all.
Yeah.
Right. And this is where I don't know if we've discussed this yet, and even if we have, we'll probably bring it up several more times, this is where we really kind of get into the difference between student and disciple. Right? A student wants the knowledge of the teacher, and the disciple wants to be the teacher, right? And Jesus was in the business of making disciples. He also had students that would come and hear him teach, and they would listen and learn from him. Mm-hmm. But there was always an application piece of the physicality of what was being taught, that you would go home and you would then live this out. Whereas I think, unfortunately, my experience and what I've seen within the church is we've become more and more, we're going to think this out, as opposed to we're going to live this out.
Or sometimes I think the applicational piece is kind of shallow.
Of course.
It's kind of like how we talked about caring for your neighbor. We're like, that means shoveling their driveway when it snows.
Right.
You know?
Which is a good thing.
It is.
But is not what that passage is about.
Right.
Yeah. And just to back up, when you say that they wanted to be the teacher, it didn't mean that they wanted to take over and start teaching. It meant they wanted to live as the teacher lived.
Yes. They wanted to emulate every piece of the teacher.
I just want to clarify, because as you were saying that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Clarification.
Yeah.
Yeah. They didn't want to kick the teacher out and be like, all right, I got this now.
But boy, do a lot of us do that, though.
Of course.
With God.
Of course. And we also do it with people in authority.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
I've not that I have an authority, but as a pastor, the number of times that people will confront me and assume that because they've attended church for the last 5 to 10 years, that they are a better authority on the text than I am, right, is a huge presumption. They might be right, right? They could very well be right, but usually the people that make that presumption are not right.
Right.
Usually the people that could make that presumption aren't actually going to make that presumption. So with this, I think it's important for us to be realizing that if we are going to live out this faith, if we are going to talk about what does it mean to be saved, then if we remove the physicalness of safety from that descriptor, we're talking about something else other than biblical salvation.
Yeah.
We're talking about a later construct and concept, right? That tends to be, say these correct words in this correct order, believe these exact doctrines in this exact way, which was not part of ancient Judaism.
Yeah.
It was instead, are you attempting to live faithfully? And by live faithfully, it means leave the corners of your field, take care of the poor and the sojourner, love your neighbor as yourself, fight for justice and mercy. Are you living a faithful life? And if you are, then you are contributing towards the well-being of your neighbor. And therefore, by contributing to the well-being of your neighbor, you're contributing to their safety.
Did the idea of salvation, when Paul is saying this here, we read this as the sort of born-again Christian being saved means you're not going to go to hell.
Right.
Would his audience at that time heard the word what would they have understood about the word salvation in that moment? Would it have just been the safety piece, or?
Yeah, I mean, literally deliverance, rescue, like in the physical sense of these words, not in the spiritual sense that we've used for deliverance, right? But if you continue to work out your deliverance from the hands of the oppressor, and your neighbors from the hands of the oppressor, of those that cause harm. Even when I'm not present, please keep doing that.
Okay, so it really was a physical thing. It wasn't like a
hybrid.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I am certain that people would also begin to attach this to resurrection was the salvation from death.
Sure.
right?
Okay.
And I would argue that's probably where some of this started to come out, that it became a spiritual concept, right? That in some way, being delivered from the grave is salvation, and that's the ultimate goal, or that is the only salvation that is worthy or necessary. And so in some ways, it's understandable how it gets there.
Mm-hmm.
The danger is we leave it there.
Right.
And we don't make it important today. I'd argue that unless the church begins to demonstrate value today, there is not a whole lot of reason to convert.
Right.
Right? Imagine if eliminate hell, and how many Christians, if you eliminate hell, would want to remain a Christian in the
often
way that it
wondered
was taught.
I've often wondered that, because I feel like that is the shotgun used to do the shotgun wedding to Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the hell bullet in the shotgun wedding. Absolutely. Here's Jesus. If you don't marry him, we're going to shoot you with this hell bullet. And by the way, you're going to love this fella. He's sweet. You just got to get to know him. Don't let the shotgun fool you.
Right.
But this is an important piece for us, because we have made the sole purpose, no pun intended, of salvation and Christianity avoiding hell and getting into heaven.
Right. Which adds layers of judging who is the right person to go into hell or heaven. And it's interesting how much of it is about believing the right thing, but then so much judgment about how other people behave.
Absolutely.
Imagine if you could take like all the time spent discussing that and money and resources spent trying to sort that out, and like instead applied it to actually meeting physical needs of people.
Right.
Right. I mean, could you imagine? So to me, the church is very unattractive right now. Right. And I would argue because the church that makes the most noise has very little concern about the safety of people.
True.
And I'm not saying individuals that participate in those churches don't care about safety of people. I'm saying that as a collective monolith, the church has not done a good job convincing the world
Right.
that it's concerned about safety of people.
Right.
And because of that, it's extraordinarily unappealing. I believe deeply if the church were to get back to this physicality of salvation, converts wouldn't be a problem.
Right.
People would want to come into something and participate alongside something that saw the greater good and well-being of the world as its mission, and would do it and run into spaces that are burning infernos in order to pull people out into safety.
Yeah.
Instead, I feel like the church has become Uvalde,
Yeah.
where the church says there is a lot of danger going on in there, but I'm not willing to go in, so I'm going to pray for them. And instead, we allow harm and destruction.
You know, I know you said earlier you don't want to critique the people who were there, so I will. No, but there is a part of me that feels like if you were a first responder, you're a police officer, that's the work you signed up for, and so there is an anger in me for them not responding in Uvalde and just standing outside and not doing what they signed up to do. And I kind of am thinking about that in the comparison you just made. Like, this is the work we signed up to do. as Christians.
I think you're making a great point. Can I say something?
Yeah.
The difference is we've been sold the same bill of goods as those first responders were.
True.
We were told that if you buy into this idea, all you have to do is say this prayer, you're good, and you're set. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of first responders across the country, I think this is changing now. When they went into becoming something of the peace,
Keeper,
whatever. You didn't imagine that you were going to start a career where you were going to fight someone with a high-powered rifle that was willing to gun down every single person.
right?
You imagined that you were going to keep kids safe at a park.
Well, but this was very interesting, and I don't think I'm going to be able to remember anything about the article other than the headline, which was that some police officers basically argued that their job is not to keep people safe. That's not their job. And that just blew my mind.
Well, I would say the church says the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's because that's what we bought, right?
Yeah.
That's what we were told.
Yeah.
That, whether you're a first responder who were told your job's to uphold the law, and therefore other people's safety is not as big of a concern.
Right. Yes.
And as Christians, we were told that you're responsible for yourself only.
Well, and upholding the law, a different law. But to an extent, I think that's also how we see ourselves, as policing certain laws. So if people break...
You mean doctrines or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if people break those, we're free to condemn them, but we are not, for some reason, obligated to the safety of other people.
So I think all this gets to is, I think our first responders, as well as Christians, as well as many others, are a victim of the system. And that's why I don't want to judge the individual officers in the Uvalde case, even if someone is responsible. My main point here is that as Christians, we have to decide, where are we? Are we on this? Are we good with the spiritual concept, which is, I said the right words in the right sequence at the right time in front of the right people, and therefore I'm good?
Right.
Or am I working out my salvation in fear and trembling?
Yeah. That's the question. It's an excellent question. Well, it feels like a good place to wrap up. Any final thoughts? Anything you want people to leave with today?
Well, I was just thinking when you said it that last time, it just made me also think about working out your salvation with fear and trembling, as interpreting that as doing things for the church, like whatever programs that they've come up with, that's like a sign of it, that you're working and you're doing things in the church, which can be good things as well. But again, taking away from meeting physical needs possibly, because if all of your time is spent doing these things to keep the church up and running and fancy and shiny, then it could be taking time and resources that could be meeting needs.
Don?
I think that sums it up, and I think hopefully the heart has already been spoken, and now we're left to wrestle with it,
To work out our salvation.
Yeah, to work out ours and others. Yep.
Yeah. I did mean the hour collectively.
I figured as much.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe, like, review, rate, all the good things for the podcast. That really helps us out. You can find us on Twitch on Mondays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern. And if you have any questions, you have a suggestion for a topic you want us to cover, just email us at info@ancientjesusfuturefaith.com. And we will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.